About 8 months ago, I took a contract job in Germany that paid almost triple what I could make at home. It was a no-brainer since my wife passed away 3 years ago, and I've been struggling to keep up with everything as a single dad. My kids, Jacob 14 and Adeline 12, were doing okay considering everything, but therapy isn't cheap and neither is the mortgage on our house. The opportunity came up through a guy I used to work with, and after thinking about it for a couple weeks, I decided to take it. It was supposed to be temporary, 6 months max, while I built up some savings. Concerned. The only issue was my kids. I couldn't bring them with me right away because of school and visa stuff, so I asked my parents if they could stay with them. Riley, they've always been super religious and kind of judgmental about my parenting, but they agreed surprisingly quick. Regretful. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. Meticulous. I set up a whole system before I left. I added my dad to my bank account so I could transfer money for the kids' expenses. We scheduled video calls 3 times a week. I even wrote out all their schedules, medications, school info, everything they'd need. My parents nodded along like they were totally on board. Slight relief. The first month went fine. Kids seemed okay on our calls, even though they looked a little tired. I was sending back about 70% of my paycheck every 2 weeks. Worried. The second month, things started getting weird. Jacob and Adeline were always in the same clothes on our calls. They looked thinner. When I asked about it, my mom would just say they were adjusting and change the subject. By month 3, I was seriously worried. The kids seemed scared during our calls and they'd barely talk. When I tried to ask what was wrong, my parents would interrupt or end the call with some excuse about dinner or church. Frustrated. I started sending messages directly to Jacob's phone, but the responses were super short. Just, "We're fine," or "Everything's okay." Eventually, he stopped responding altogether. Shocked. I was planning to fly home for a visit when I got a call that made my blood run cold. It was from Child Protective Services back home. Horrified. They said my kids had been found begging outside a shopping center with signs that said, "Our father is a monster," and "Help us, our dad abandoned us for drugs." I literally dropped everything. Told my boss I had a family emergency and was on a plane within hours. Frantic. The whole flight, I was going insane thinking about what could have happened. I kept calling my parents, but no answer. I tried Jacob's phone, nothing. Determined. When I landed, I went straight to the CPS office. The social worker looked at me like I was dirt when I walked in, but her whole attitude changed when I showed her my ID and explained that I'd been working in Europe. She told me my parents had been making my kids stand on street corners with those signs for months. They told everyone in our town that I was a junkie who abandoned my family. The money I'd been sending, my parents were keeping all of it. My kids weren't getting new clothes or proper food or anything. Jacob had lost almost 20 pounds, and Adeline, God, some creep had approached her while she was out there alone and touched her. The police had found them after someone called it in, and when the cops questioned my parents, they said they didn't know who the kids were, called them bastards, and refused to let them back in the house. I can't even describe what it felt like seeing my kids in that office. They were both so skinny and dirty. Jacob wouldn't look at me at first. He actually believed what my parents had told him, that I'd abandoned them for drugs. Adeline just broke down crying when she saw me. It took hours to convince them I'd been sending money the whole time, that I'd been working my ass off for them. The social worker showed me all the evidence they'd gathered. Pictures of my kids holding those signs, statements from neighbors who said my parents would lock them outside in all weather, medical reports showing malnutrition, and texts from my parents to other family members talking about how they were teaching the children the truth about their father. When I asked why they would do this, the social worker explained my parents had told everyone they were showing the children what life with a sinner was like. Apparently, they've always thought I was a bad father because I let my kids watch secular TV and didn't force them to go to church 3 times a week. They decided to use my absence to correct my parenting by traumatizing my children. I got temporary custody back after showing all my employment paperwork and the bank transfers. We're staying at a hotel now because I'm scared to go back to our house. My parents have keys, and I don't trust them not to show up. Jacob finally started talking to me last night. He said they would wake them up at 5 a.m. to pray, then make them stand on different corners with those signs from 7 a.m. until dark. They weren't allowed to eat if they didn't get enough people to stop and witness their suffering. They told my kids I was shooting up heroin in Europe and had forgotten all about them. I'm meeting with a lawyer tomorrow. I've already filed police reports, but that's not enough. What they did to my children goes beyond anything I could have imagined. They broke something inside my kids that might never heal. My daughter flinches when anyone gets close to her. My son can't sleep without checking the locks 10 times. I know everyone says you shouldn't act out of anger, but I don't care anymore. I've spent the last week planning something that will make them regret ever touching my children. It's all perfectly legal, but it's going to destroy their precious reputation and their comfortable life. I've already put things in motion, and I just got the first panicked voicemail from my dad asking, "What did you do?" and saying, "I'm destroying the family." You want to know what destroys a family? Making children believe their father abandoned them. Making them beg on street corners, starving them, and letting them be assaulted. This is just the beginning. I'm not stopping until they've lost everything they care about, just like they almost made me lose my children. Update 1. I was honestly surprised by how many people responded. Didn't expect this to blow up the way it did. It's been a week since I got my kids back, and every day I learn something new that makes me want to burn my parents' world to the ground. We moved out of the hotel and into a short-term rental I found through Airbnb. Cost a fortune, but I needed somewhere the kids could feel safe. First thing I did was change the locks at our actual house. My parents still had keys from when they watched the place after Sarah died, and there was no way in hell I was bringing my kids back there until I knew they couldn't just walk in. The therapist I found for the kids suggested I let them talk about what happened at their own pace. Jacob started opening up first, which was kind of surprising, since he's usually the quiet one. What he told me made me physically sick. Apparently, the day after I left for Germany, my parents sat both kids down and told them I wasn't actually going to work. I was running away to do drugs. They showed them some old photos from my college days where I looked wasted at parties. Yeah, I drank in college like literally everyone else. And said this was proof of my addiction. When Jacob defended me, my dad smacked him across the face and told him not to speak the devil's lies. For the first month, they kept the kids locked in the house. No school, no friends, no nothing. They made them pray for hours on their knees until they were crying from pain. If they complained or questioned anything, they weren't allowed to eat. All this time, my parents were telling their church friends that the kids were adjusting to the trauma of abandonment. Then they started with the signs. My dad would drive them to different shopping areas every day and make them stand there with those horrible signs for hours. If they didn't get enough people to stop and talk to them about their drug addict father, they'd have to stand there even longer the next day. The worst part? They made my kids call people from my contact list and tell them I'd abandoned them for drugs. My coworkers, my friends, even Sarah's parents. No wonder no one tried to check on them. Everyone thought I was some junkie who'd run off to Europe. Yesterday, Adeline finally talked to me about what happened to her. Some guy approached her while she was standing alone. My parents would separate them to cover more ground. He started asking her weird questions and then touched her arm and face before someone intervened. She was so scared she peed herself, and when my mom found out, she made Adeline stand there in wet clothes for 3 more hours as punishment for drawing attention. I swear to God, I almost put my fist through the wall when she told me that. I went to the bank yesterday to figure out where all the money I sent went. Turns out my dad opened a new account after I left, not the joint one I'd set up. He forged my signature on documents to transfer funds from our joint account to this new one only in his name. The bank manager looked pretty uncomfortable when I showed him the transfer receipts from Germany and explained the situation. He said they'd investigate for fraud, but it would take time. The real kicker? My parents used my money to make a massive donation to their church's troubled youth ministry. Nearly $40,000. Money that was supposed to feed and clothe my children. The bank statements show they barely spent anything on Jacob and Adeline. Just the absolute minimum to keep them alive. This morning, my mom showed up at our rental. No idea how she found the address. Probably through someone at my kid's school or something. I was out getting groceries, but Jacob called me, freaking out. By the time I got back, my mom was trying to force her way in, saying she needed to save her grandchildren from their father's sinful influence. Jacob had pushed a bookshelf in front of the door and was holding it there. I lost it. Completely fucking lost it. I grabbed her by the arm and physically moved her away from my door. She started screaming about how I was hurting her and how she'd call the police. I told her to go ahead. I had documentation of what they did to my kids. She changed her tune real quick, started crying about how they were just trying to teach the children about sin and that I was corrupting them with secular values. I asked her point blank, "Why did you tell everyone I was a drug addict? You know that's not true." Her answer made me realize how truly fucked up my parents are. She said they couldn't tell people they were watching their grandkids while their son worked abroad because it would make them look bad for enabling my lifestyle. Apparently, letting my kids watch Netflix and eat non-organic food counts as child abuse in their book. So they made up the drug story to make themselves look like saviors taking in these poor abandoned children. And the money? They couldn't in good conscience use drug money for the children, so they purified it by donating it to the church. When I pointed out it was my money from my job, she just shook her head like I was too stupid to understand. I called my friend Rob after this. He's a paralegal and knows how the legal system works. He came over and looked through all the documentation I've gathered, the bank statements, the medical reports, the CPS files, everything. He said we have enough for criminal charges of child abuse, fraud, and probably identity theft too. But criminal charges aren't enough. These people nearly destroyed my children. They took away their sense of safety, their trust, their health, and almost their relationship with me. The kids are having nightmares every night. Jacob flinches whenever someone raises their voice. Adeline won't go outside alone anymore. So I've started implementing my plan. First step was filing for an emergency restraining order, which was granted yesterday. My parents can't come within 500 feet of me or my kids. Second step was reaching out to my uncle Steve, my dad's brother who they've been feuding with for years. Turns out their church has been trying to buy his land for a new youth center, and my parents have been pressuring him to sell below market value for the Lord. Steve was very interested to hear about where the $40,000 went. Third step was contacting their church directly. I sent their pastor all the documentation, medical reports showing the kids' malnutrition, police reports, everything. Included pictures of the signs they made my kids hold. Asked him if this is what Jesus would do. Haven't heard back yet, but I know my parents' entire social life revolves around that church. Their reputation there means everything to them. Fourth step involves their finances, and that's what's got them calling me nonstop today. Apparently, their precious church has suspended my dad from his position as treasurer pending an investigation. My mom's been removed from the children's ministry schedule, and Uncle Steve showed up at their house with a real estate agent to discuss the property line dispute they've had for years. My dad left me a voicemail an hour ago. He was practically crying, saying I'm destroying the family and bringing shame to the family name. Said my actions are worse than anything they did and that I need to consider the consequences of my choices. Consequences? They haven't seen consequences yet. This is just the beginning. I'm meeting with an actual lawyer tomorrow to discuss pursuing civil charges for the money they stole. And I've got more planned. Things that'll hit them where it really hurts. Their precious reputation and their bank account. My kids deserve justice, and I'm going to make sure they get it. Update 2. Quick update for those following this nightmare. It's been 2 weeks since my last post, and things have been moving fast. The kids are still in therapy twice a week, and we finally moved back into our actual house last weekend. Took a few days to clean everything. My parents had apparently been using it as a storage space for all their church donation crap while we were gone. When we were sorting through stuff in the kids' rooms, Jacob found a journal my mom had forced him to keep. She made him write daily confessions about his sinful thoughts and how much he missed his father despite his wickedness. Reading that shit made me want to puke. There were entries where he wrote about being so hungry he couldn't sleep, but that he deserved it for defending me. Adeline had a similar notebook hidden under her mattress. The lawyer I hired, Melissa, is honestly a fucking pit bull. When I showed her those journals along with all the other evidence, she didn't even blink, just started typing notes faster. She explained we have two paths: criminal charges, which are being handled by the DA's office already, and a civil lawsuit for the stolen money, emotional damages, and medical costs. Here's where it gets interesting. Remember that $40,000 my parents donated to their church? Turns out they didn't just donate it. They set up some kind of family legacy fund in their names, basically taking credit for my money. Melissa found this out when she contacted the church treasurer who replaced my dad. She said we can not only get that money back, but potentially treble damages because of how they obtained it. I got a weird call from my Aunt Karen, my mom's sister, a few days ago. Apparently, my parents have been calling everyone in the family, claiming I'm having some kind of mental breakdown and making up horrible lies about them. Karen was skeptical at first, asked if I was sure I wasn't exaggerating what happened. I didn't argue. Just texted her pictures of the kids when I first found them, the medical reports showing malnutrition, and screenshots of the bank transfers. She went completely silent for like 2 minutes before saying she needed to call my cousin Rebecca, who'd been watching my parents' house while they were at some prayer retreat last weekend. Turns out my parents had told Rebecca I was a violent drug addict who might try to break in while they were gone. They'd even changed their locks and installed some cheap security cameras. Rebecca had been checking their mail and found a letter from their church about my dad's suspension and an investigation into financial irregularities. She'd been confused since it didn't match what they'd told her about why they weren't at church lately. They claimed they were taking a sabbatical. The family grapevine went into overdrive. By yesterday afternoon, I'd gotten calls from 5 different relatives wanting to know what the hell was going on. My parents had apparently been telling different stories to different people for months. Some thought I was in rehab, others thought I'd abandoned the kids completely. A few even thought I was in jail. Uncle Steve came through in a big way. He invited me and the kids over for dinner last night and showed me what he'd been working on. Apparently there's some bylaw in their neighborhood about property maintenance and community standards. My parents have been reported for violations at least 6 times over the years, but my dad always managed to get the complaints dismissed because he was friends with someone on the board. Steve submitted formal complaints with documentation of all the violations: overgrown trees hanging over his property, drainage issues, improper fence placement, and requested a full inspection and review. The best part? The fines for these violations are no joke. We're talking thousands of dollars potentially. And since my dad is no longer in his church leadership position, he doesn't have the pull to make it go away this time. I also found out something else disturbing yesterday. Jacob mentioned that whenever they'd call me during those video chats, my parents would stand right behind the camera with written notes telling them what to say. If they went off script, they'd get punished after. No wonder they always seemed so stiff and scared. They literally had my mom holding up cue cards with shit like, "We're fine," and "We miss you," while threatening them. And I had no fucking idea. That revelation led to another piece of the puzzle. My mom's phone had been synced to our family cloud account the whole time. I never thought to check it until Jacob mentioned the scripts. When I logged in, there were hundreds of deleted text messages that had been backed up automatically. Messages between my parents discussing how to break the children of their worldly attachments and cleanse them of their father's influence. There were also messages to church members asking for prayer for our poor grandchildren who've been abandoned by their sinful father. All while I was sending money and calling regularly. They were literally planning this shit from day one. The most damning messages were about the money. My dad texted my mom about how they could use Diego's drug money for God's glory and that no one would question a donation from respected church elders. They weren't just being cruel, they were fucking proud of themselves for stealing from me and abusing my kids. I forwarded everything to Melissa. She called this morning saying this was a smoking gun that proves they knew exactly what they were doing. She's having fraud and conspiracy charges to our case. My parents tried to counterattack yesterday. My dad showed up at Jacob's school claiming he needed to pick him up for a family emergency. Thankfully, I'd already updated all the emergency contact forms and specifically listed them as prohibited from contact. The school called me immediately, and by the time I got there, the principal had already called the police because my dad was making a scene in the office, shouting about his rights as a grandparent. The cops showed up and reminded him about the restraining order. He tried to argue that it didn't apply at the school, which is just fucking stupid. One of the officers actually knew about our case already because he'd been briefed about the potential child abuse charges. My dad left before they could arrest him, but not before yelling that I was poisoning his grandchildren against God. This morning, I woke to 37 missed calls and a bunch of increasingly desperate voicemails from both my parents. Apparently, the church elders called an emergency meeting last night, and they've been formally removed from all church activities pending a full investigation. The pastor directly referenced the evidence I sent and said they needed to search their hearts and make amends. My mom was literally sobbing in one message, saying I've destroyed everything they've worked for and that the entire congregation is talking about them. My dad's messages started out angry, then got weirdly pleading. He actually suggested we come to an arrangement where I clarify some misunderstandings with their church friends in exchange for them dropping their grievances against me. What fucking grievances? They abuse my kids. I didn't respond to any of it. Instead, I called their mortgage company. Turns out they refinanced their house 6 months ago and took out a sizable equity loan. The customer service rep couldn't tell me what it was for, but the timing lines up with when they started donating to the church. I'm betting they used my money for the donation and then took out loans to cover their actual expenses. Melissa says we can subpoena those records as part of our case. I also found out from Uncle Steve that they've been trying to sell their vacation cabin up north, the one my grandfather left them that's been in the family for generations. They've apparently slashed the price twice already, which suggests they're desperate for cash. The walls are closing in on them and they know it. Every attempt they've made to turn people against me has backfired spectacularly once people see the evidence. Even their pastor isn't buying their bullshit anymore. The kids are starting to do better, slowly. Jacob actually played video games with a friend online yesterday. First time he's shown interest in anything fun since I got back. Adeline is still having nightmares, but she's talking more. Her therapist suggested getting a dog might help her feel safer, so we're looking at rescue shelters this weekend. Tomorrow is the preliminary hearing for the criminal charges. Melissa says it's just procedural, but my parents will have to appear in court. She also filed our civil suit yesterday. We're asking for the $40,000 plus additional damages. She thinks we could be looking at 6 figures when all is said and done. But this isn't just about money. It's about justice. These people tortured my children while stealing from me and smearing my name. They don't get to just apologize and move on. I want them to lose everything that matters to them. Their reputation, their standing in the church, their financial security. I want them to feel even a fraction of the pain and fear they caused my kids. And from the increasingly panicked voicemails I keep getting, it's working. Final update. So this is probably my last update on this whole nightmare situation. It's been almost a month since my last post, and a lot has happened. Thanks to everyone who's been following along and offering support. Sometimes typing this shit out is the only way I can process it without losing my mind. The preliminary hearing for the criminal charges went exactly as Melissa, my lawyer, predicted. My parents showed up with some church friend who apparently has a law degree but mostly handles like real estate closings and wills. The guy looked completely out of his depth when the prosecutor started listing all the charges. Child endangerment, child abuse, fraud, identity theft, and misappropriation of funds. The judge took one look at the evidence, especially those journals the kids were forced to keep, and set a trial date for 3 months from now. My parents' lawyer tried to argue that they were just exercising their religious freedom in how they raised the kids. The judge actually laughed and said religious freedom doesn't cover starving children or making them beg on street corners. But that was just the warm-up. 2 days after the hearing, I got a call from the bank's fraud department. They'd completed their investigation and confirmed that my dad had forged my signature on multiple documents. They're pressing charges separately, and they're freezing all of my parents' accounts while they trace where my money went. The bank manager actually apologized to me, which was weird, but kind of nice. Without access to their accounts, my parents started scrambling. Last week, they finally sold their cabin, the one that's been in the family for like 4 generations, for about 60% of what it's worth. Uncle Steve told me they were desperate for cash because the property violations he reported ended up costing them almost $15,000 in fines and required repairs. The church situation blew up in their faces too. Remember that family legacy fund they set up with my money? The church board voted unanimously to return all $40,000 plus interest to me as part of the civil case. But the real kicker was when the pastor announced to the entire congregation that my parents were temporarily banned from church property due to grave moral failures inconsistent with the teachings of Christ. My mom's sister Karen called me last Friday to tell me that my mom has been basically ostracized by all her church friends. Apparently, she tried to host her weekly Bible study group and literally no one showed up. When she called around to find out why, people either didn't answer or told her they couldn't associate with someone who would treat children that way. Karen said my mom was so hard, she could barely understand her. Meanwhile, Jacob and Adeline are doing better. Not great, but better. We adopted a rescue dog, a super chill golden retriever mix named Buddy, who basically follows Adeline everywhere. Having him around has helped her feel safer, and she's actually sleeping through the night most of the time now. Jacob's still pretty angry, but his therapist says that's actually a healthy reaction to what happened. He's started playing basketball again, which is huge since he used to love it before all this shit went down. Last weekend was Sarah's birthday, my late wife, and we all went to visit her grave. It was the first time we'd been there since I got back from Germany. I half expected it to be this super depressing day, but the kids actually wanted to tell their mom about everything, even the bad stuff. Jacob sat there talking to her headstone about how the grandparents had lied about me and how he was sorry he believed them at first. Adeline put flowers down and promised her mom she was trying to be brave. I just sat there listening, thinking about how fucking proud Sarah would be of these kids for surviving what they did. That night, I got a text from my dad asking if we could meet to discuss terms, like this is some kind of business negotiation. I didn't respond. Then my mom started calling nonstop. I finally picked up after like the 20th call, and she immediately launched into this whole speech about how I was tearing apart the family and dishonoring my parents and how the Bible says children should respect their elders. I let her finish her whole rant and then just asked her one question. Did she ever stop to think about how her actions were affecting her grandchildren? Not me, not their reputation, not their standing in the church, just two innocent kids who trusted them. She got real quiet and then started with the excuses again. They were trying to save the children's souls. They were worried about my influence, blah, blah, blah. I hung up on her mid-sentence. The next day, they showed up at our house, just pulled into the driveway like the restraining order didn't exist. I called the police immediately, but before they arrived, my dad started pounding on the door, yelling for me to come out and face him like a man. Jacob and Adeline both ran to their rooms, and the dog started barking like crazy. I recorded the whole thing on my phone through the window. My dad was screaming about how I'd ruined their lives, how they'd lost all their friends, how they might lose their house because of the legal fees and fines. My mom was literally on her knees on our front porch, wailing about forgiveness and family. When the police showed up, my parents tried to claim they were just there to check on the children's welfare. The officers reminded them about the restraining order and said the next violation would mean jail time. As they were being escorted back to their car, my dad turned and shouted that I was worse than them because at least they were trying to save the children while I was just being vengeful. And you know what? He's right about the vengeful part. I am being vengeful, and I don't feel bad about it at all. 3 days ago, Melissa called with an update on our civil case. My parents' lawyer reached out about a potential settlement. They're offering to sign over the deed to their house to me if I'll drop the civil suit. The house is worth way more than what they stole from me, but Melissa says they're desperate because if we go to trial, they'll lose everything anyway and have a fraud judgment on their record that will follow them forever. I told her I needed to think about it. Part of me wants to refuse, just to force them through a humiliating public trial. But another part of me thinks taking their house, the place they've lived for 35 years, the place they're so proud of, the place where they host all their church functions, might be the perfect poetic justice. Yesterday, I finally decided. I told Melissa to counter their offer. I'll take the house, but they also have to sign a legally binding document admitting to everything they did to the kids. No euphemisms, no religious justifications, just the plain, ugly truth. And they have to sign it in front of the kids' therapists, so the kids can see them take responsibility. Their lawyer called back today. They've agreed to my terms. We're meeting tomorrow to sign everything. Jacob asked me this morning if I hate his grandparents. I had to think about it for a minute. I told him I don't hate them exactly. I just don't recognize them anymore. The people who raised me weren't perfect, but they would never have done what they did to him and Adeline. It's like they turned into completely different people once they thought no one was watching. He nodded and said he feels the same way. Then he asked if we could sell their house once we get it and use the money for college.
Smart kid. That's exactly what we're going to do. So, that's where things stand. My parents are broke, socially isolated, facing criminal charges, and about to be homeless. Their church has abandoned them. Their friends have abandoned them. Even most of the family has taken our side after seeing the evidence. All because they thought they could abuse 2 kids, steal money, and lie about me without consequences. I don't know what they'll do next or where they'll go. And honestly, I don't care. My focus is on Jacob and Adeline and helping them heal from what happened. We still got a long road ahead, but at least now there's a sense that justice is being served. Sometimes I catch myself feeling a tiny bit guilty about how thoroughly I've destroyed their lives. Then I remember Adeline flinching when someone raises their voice, or Jacob checking the locks 3 times before he can sleep, or the way both kids still hide food in their rooms because they're afraid of being hungry again. And suddenly, I don't feel guilty anymore.